We're in Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to start in verse 8. Hebrews 11:8. We got down as far as by faith Noah last week. We're going to pick up with by faith Abraham. I think one of the most important things to know about Abraham, well, a couple of things. Number one, Abraham's faith was not born full grown. He really struggled with some things, but he was always dedicated to God. So he was willing to do whatever God told him to do, even sometimes when it would not have made any sense at all. But there were times when he didn't have direct guidance from God, or when he didn't take the time to go find direct guidance from God, that he did some things that we would find really questionable. But he lived in a different time and a different place. And so he made some decisions based on his faith and his understanding of God that maybe we would not have made. But as you watch him get farther and farther toward the end of his life, he makes some amazing decisions. And those are the ones that he's remembered for. And I think those are the ones that the Hebrew writer gives him credit for. He doesn't mention the not so much by faith episodes. And even the things that he talks about by faith Abraham or by faith Sarah, some of those things we know a little too much about what actually happened to just give Abraham a pass and say, well, yeah, he was such a faithful guy. He did some things that didn't look like faith. But you think about his situation. What did he know about God compared to what we know about God? There's not much. When he was living in Ur of the Chaldees, there's a very good chance that he and all the people that lived around him worshiped the sun god. That, he wasn't a Yahweh worshiper from the beginning. God called him and made a covenant with him. And Abraham didn't so much choose God as God chose Abraham. And as Abraham's faith grew and his understanding of God grew, then we see him do some things that are definitely worth applause. And again, the Hebrew writer was himself a Hebrew and was a big fan. And so the way that he reports Abraham's life is very complimentary. All right. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Now that's a poetic way of saying that Abraham trusted God for his place of abode, not necessarily that he was looking for an actual city and an actual place, but that God had promised him a place of abode, and he believed that God was going to give him that place. How much land did Abraham eventually end up owning in Canaan during his lifetime?
Not much.
Absolutely none.
I thought he didn't buy.
Well, you're right. He bought a place to bury his wife.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, he spent a lifetime following God's directions. Now, his descendants inherited the land. They were blessed through him and through his faithful life. But as far as Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as well, they were sojourners. They lived in a place that wasn't theirs. Sometimes that really caused a problem for them. If you remember when Jacob was digging wells, and as he would dig a well, then the people of the area would come and fill the well back in, and they kept going through that sequence of events time after time after time. Well, it was because he wasn't them. He had to finally find a place that they would allow him to have his own water source on somebody else's place, I suppose. It was all free range, I guess, in those days. There weren't fences to keep you in or to keep you out. But
free water.
Free water. Now, during this time frame, the Hebrew writer doesn't mention a few things. He trusted God and followed God into Canaan. He settles down kind of toward the southern edge of Canaan for a while, near Beersheba. The biggest that Israel ever was is referred to as from Dan to Beersheba. Dan is in the north, Beersheba is in the south, almost close enough to say you're on your way to Egypt. So he moved down to the south. He's trusting beyond his knowledge. He doesn't know God as well as we know God. So he's over his depth. He's in over his head, working with God. And you don't see God appearing to him constantly. There are several times that God deals with Abraham, and he deals with him one-on-one, whereas with us, we get it through Scripture, and he doesn't come tell us exactly one-on-one what he wants. But Abraham is dealing with probably a period of time that he hears from God, and then it may be months before, at least what's recorded, months, even years later, that God would come and give him more information. But that fits the Hebrew writer's introduction quite well. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. He didn't own the land. He didn't have a child. All of the things God was promising him were as of yet not seen. So he leaves Canaan, goes down to Egypt. The Egyptians see Sarah and see that she's beautiful. So what does he do? He says, you tell them that you're my sister. So he gives his wife to Pharaoh. Bad things happen to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh gives her back. Sarah says, the promise that God gave us isn't working out as we thought it might. So let me give you my handmaid, and you can have a child with my handmaid. And this is terrible for Sarah on a lot of different levels. A, she hadn't been able to conceive. B, when she gives Abraham her handmaid and the handmaid conceives, it drives home the point that it wasn't Abraham's fault. Right? You might have been able to say, well, maybe Abraham's not fertile, but Sarah couldn't have a child, but Hagar could. So, and then all of a sudden he's got a son, and that son's not her son. So there are all kinds of levels of problems that came out of that. They offered Ishmael to God as the child of promise, and God says, no, it's going to be a child from Abraham and Sarah. It's not going to be a child from Abraham and somebody else. But in the meantime, he saved Lot from being a captive to the kings of the plain and paid a tenth to Melchizedek. So he does some wonderful things in the same time frame that you look at and you say, well, why would he have done that? Well, there's some level of understanding. There's some level of faith going on with Abraham as he's growing. It takes 25 years from the time that God promises Abraham a son to the time that he finally brings the son through Sarah. So 25 years waiting on Isaac to be born. When the promise is first made, Sarah is old enough that we might assume that she wouldn't have a child. When she finally gives birth to Isaac, she's old enough that we know there's zero chance that she's going to have a child. She was 89 when she became pregnant, 90 when she gave birth. Abraham was 99 when she became pregnant and 100 years old. So he goes from 75, she was 65 when they first heard that they were going to have a child. So already at 65, you're going to assume that Sarah's not a good candidate. But at 90, there's just no natural explanation. So again, your faith has to grow because God did something that was absolutely impossible by human standards. And so again, Abraham's faith grows. Look at verse 11. By faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. Again, this is one of those places where the Hebrew writer says, I really, really like Abraham and Sarah. So I'm going to tell the parts that are complimentary. How strong was Sarah's faith when she was 89 and the Lord said, in 1 year I will come back and you will have a son? How do we know how much faith she had? By her reaction. What did she do? She laughed. Now, not necessarily laughing at God, but laughing about something that the Lord has promised. You know, how shall I, being this old, have a child? How's that going to happen? Some commentators give her a break. And it's not a bad explanation, but they say his name, Isaac, is laughter. Maybe she was just happy. She laughed because she was happy. But the Lord asks the question, why did you laugh? And then Sarah does something besides just laughing to the Lord. She lies to the Lord. She says, I wasn't laughing. So the Hebrew writer kind of goes over that part. By faith, Sarah, past childbearing age, was able to bear children because she considered him faithful who made the promise. So perhaps at some point she considered him faithful, but there were moments when she was in over her depth, when Abraham was in over his, and they had to struggle to keep up with the things that God was promising because it didn't seem likely, and then it didn't seem possible at all for her to have a child. Now look at that last phrase in 12. They had descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as countless as the sand on the seashore. That's the promise that God kept giving to Abraham. If you can count the stars, that's how many offspring I'm going to give you. If you can count the sand, then that's how many offspring I'm going to give you. Did Abraham and Sarah start a progeny that is just numberless? Absolutely. Millions upon millions, right? During World War II, Hitler was responsible for killing about 6 million, right? So that's a pretty hefty number, but all of them didn't die, just the ones that he could get to at the time. And so I don't know what the population of, not necessarily purebred Hebrews, but Hebrews that can at least reasonably check their ancestry back toward Abraham. There's still millions of people left, even after all these different times throughout history that folks have tried to get rid of them. And the reason that that's important is because verse 13 is kind of ambiguous. It says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. And I want to read down through here and overemphasize some words for you, and then we'll try to figure out who all these people are. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Right? Abraham was looking for a city with a foundation whose builder and maker is God. And then we get into a section that says all of these people that were descendant from Abraham were looking for something that they never quite received, but they all died in faith. Okay? Is they referring to all the Hebrew people that descended from Abraham? Or are they somebody else? Two possibilities that I came up with, maybe neither one of them is correct. Number one is that when you read the end of 12 and 13 together, they are like descendants that are numerous as the stars in the sky, as countless as the sand on the seashore, all these people. So Abraham's offspring, Abraham and Sarah's offspring. That's what it seems to be saying. It's really hard to think in terms of all of Abraham's offspring remaining faithful. When you get to Solomon's day and the kingdom divides, 10 northern tribes take up worshiping Baal and Asherah. Right? Eventually, they're taken off into Assyrian captivity and never come back. So were all of those people living in faith when they died? Maybe this is another place where the Hebrew writer loves Hebrew people. And so he's saying, well, all of those people that followed Abraham's example, all of his offspring, lived and died the same way that Abraham did. I don't know. It's a difficult thing. The other possibility is we've got more folks to discuss, right? Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, all the prophets, that he's talking about those people, the ones who were descended from Abraham that lived out the faith of Abraham. So not just the physical progeny, but the spiritual ones, the ones who really followed after Abraham. In the New Testament, Paul is discussing those who are Jew by birth and those who are grafted in through Messiah. And he talks about spiritual Israel. All of these are of Israel. Not Israel after the flesh, but Israel after the Spirit. So it would even include us. But he uses a picture of Abraham's life to describe them. They were foreigners and strangers on the earth as he was foreigner and stranger in Canaan. They were looking for a country of their own as he was looking for a place of his own. They had the chance to go back to that place they had left. Abraham had a place to go back to Ur of the Chaldees. So there are all kinds of possibilities there. So it's a little bit difficult to pick the right group. But whoever they are, the Hebrew writer holds them in high regard. They lived a life like Abraham lived his life. A life that was full of faith, even if it wasn't knowledgeable faith, it was a faith that trusted God even in the lack of knowledge. And like I said, we're getting ready to look at Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and on and on. All right, look at verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Remember, Abraham and Sarah say, "Let's use Ishmael." And God says, "No, you're going to have your own son." So this is the child of promise. And now God says, "I want you to take him up to Mount Moriah and to sacrifice him. It's through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. Okay? There's something that the Hebrew writer provides for us here that is not provided for us in the Old Testament. Did you pick out what it was? Abraham's faith that God could raise Isaac from the dead. The Hebrew writer says he knows what was going on in Abraham's mind, right? He reasoned that God could even raise the dead. When you read this passage in Genesis 22, it doesn't mention that. It's very to the point, very blunt. They get headed toward Moriah. They've got the knife, they've got the rope, they've got the wood, and Isaac says, "Father, we've got the wood, but where's the sacrifice?" Abraham says, "God will provide a lamb for the sacrifice." So maybe in Abraham's mind, he's thinking there'll be some other answer at the end of this. But they get all the way to Moriah. He builds the altar. He puts the wood on the altar. He binds his son, puts his son on the altar. And then finally an angel intervenes. But in the mind of the Hebrew writer, maybe by influence of the Holy Spirit, we needed to know more. That we needed to understand that Abraham's faith had gotten to a place where he figured, even if God lets me kill him, God will raise him from the dead and give him back to me. So again, that's given to us in Hebrews 11, but not in the Old Testament. So a lot of times when you're studying the Old Testament, somebody will say, "Oh, well, he must have figured that God could raise him from the dead." Well, that's what the Hebrew writer says, but he says it hundreds, of years later. So he's explaining a little bit of the history that the Old Testament doesn't give to us. When
faith was that God would provide.
That God would provide. That's in chapter 22. That's our family motto, Yahweh Jireh, God will provide. And Becky and I have lived by that for years and years. It's Abraham's understanding of God at that point was, whatever I need, God's going to take care of it. So he's lived through, I'll find you a place to live. There was a place to live. I'll give you a son of your own. I gave you something. So everything God said he would do, he's done. Maybe not to the extent that Abraham would have liked, or for the permanence that Abraham might have liked. But God had done everything God was promising to do. And now he says, give him back. So Abraham says, well, God will provide. I just have to trust him. I just have to do what he told me to do. And then again, the Hebrew writer says, and he must have been thinking, right? He was sure that God could even raise the dead. So in a manner of speaking, he did receive him back from the dead. All of us will agree that Abraham had murdered his son in his mind. He had sacrificed his son in his heart. He had the knife. He had it raised. He was going to do what God told him to do. And then God intervened and stopped him from doing it. So Abraham's faith level is at a whole different place than it was even when God said, follow me and I'll show you a new place. I'll show you a new home. That's nice. I want you to kill your own son is on a whole other level. And in the English, he says that he is going to sacrifice his one and only son. And a good teacher would have gone back and looked at the Greek. But I would be very surprised if that phrase in the Greek is not monogenes. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his monogenes son, his one-of-a-kind son, one and only son. And I bet you, at least in the Hebrew text here, I don't do Jewish Hebrew, but I bet you in the Greek right there, it says, God told Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your monogenes son, your one-of-a-kind, your one and only. And when Abraham said, yes, I'll do it, that's monumental to what God does through Jesus later on. You have a human being who trusted God enough to say, yes, I'll do what you tell me to do. And then God later on reveals that that's what he had in mind all along, that he was going to sacrifice his one-of-a-kind son so that we could have life. And you can even, this will preach. Abraham figured, well, God can raise the dead. Well, all you got to do is read the Gospels. He sacrificed his monogenes son, and then he raised him from the dead. So all of the stuff Abraham believed to be true actually was, but he didn't have the kind of knowledge of the subject that we do. All right. Any questions or thoughts about any of that? No. Okay. We'll see you guys later.